Chris, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
As always. Now, look, we've got, obviously, media days galore getting cranked up. I'm going to head over to Atlanta for the traveling circus. That's what it's about to become, I guess, with SEC Media Days making an appearance in Hotlanta. You're going to be over in Dallas for the Big 12 Media Days. What about it, Chris? You think there's a possibility in the not-too-distant future that maybe we see the SEC really try to invade Big 12 country and maybe stage this Media Days event right there in the Big D?
It'd be interesting with SEC Media Days moving around. I could see it happening. I think Houston would probably be a better choice for the SEC because the LSU Texas A&M footprint is right there in that city, and honestly, that city leans towards the SEC in the first place. But it wouldn't surprise me a bit if the SEC tries to expand its footprint a bit, and we've already seen it with Texas A&M, so why not go in Texas a little more if you can?
Yeah, might as well take advantage of that aforementioned blueprint that that footprint that you touched on there. Quickly, before we get more into the SEC side of things for the next week, Baker Mayfield, that era is over at Oklahoma. With that, what are some of the storylines that you're anticipating out there in Dallas with the Big 12 Media Days?
I think, as always, it kind of has to do with quarterbacks. Obviously, you mentioned Baker Mayfield. From Oklahoma's perspective, Kyler Murray is the next guy up. I think he surprised a lot of people by going number 8 overall in the MLB draft a couple months back. But he will be at Oklahoma this year playing quarterback, and a big story is going to be how Oklahoma's offense under Lincoln Riley kind of shifts with Kyler. He's a little bit more athletic and a little bit more of a runner than Baker ever was, and it's going to change a bit. Texas has a big quarterback battle going on between Sam Ehlinger and Shane Buechele. Those two battled it out all last year, and it's kind of not decided heading into fall camp, and that's a big storyline. And then the best player in the conference is likely Will Grier, another quarterback who's one of the top returners in college football. If West Virginia's defense can kind of step it up a little bit, Will Grier is a pretty safe bet as a dark horse for the Heisman. He's going to put up huge numbers this season. So those would be 3 of the bigger ones that I'd be looking at.
And Will Grier kind of bridging the gap between the SEC and Big 12 Media Days as the former starting quarterback there at the University of Florida. As for SEC Media Days, Chris, what do you expect to be the buzz coming out of Atlanta next week?
I have to imagine new coaches make the biggest splashes. Jeremy Pruitt, Dan Mullen, quite a few others, honestly, with so much SEC turnover. Sorry, Jimbo Fisher, Chad Morris. You could go on for a while, but I would expect that to be the biggest storyline. Obviously, Alabama's quarterback battle is going to be the subject of intrigue. I'm not really sure, but there's been a lot of movement on that with Tua kind of coming back from injury, but that's going to be a popular topic of conversation. And then since the transfer rule's out of the way, I would think that'll be a topic that we can put on the back burner, and hopefully we can focus a bit more on football this time around come SEC Media Days.
Come on, this is SEC Media Days. We talk about everything but football when we get together for this zoo that has become one of the biggest spectacles, certainly, in the college football offseason, no doubt about that. Now, you mentioned Dan Mullen taking over there at Florida. He recently was quoted as saying he thinks there's a shift in power coming from a divisional standpoint within the SEC. He seems to feel pretty strongly that the trend is moving more towards the East. Georgia won the Southeastern Conference Championship, broke that lengthy, long stranglehold that the SEC West had on conference championships there in the SEC. What do you think? Do you see it coming? I know you wrote about this on 247sports.com here in the last week or so. You buy in Dan Mullen's comments, Chris, that there's a shift in power coming from the West moving over to the East.
I'm buying that Dan Mullen knows how to talk to fans as a first-year head coach, but no. I think it's going to be a little bit longer. I think the simplest answer with that is when does Nick Saban end up retiring, and that's when you could potentially see a shift in the SEC West to East. But right now, I don't see it. And my story, I kind of touched on how the SEC's kind of worked in ebbs and flows throughout its time, and it's basically gone in line with the great coaches. So Philip Fulmer and Steve Spurrier kind of dominated the early era of the SEC when the conferences came about, or the divisions within the conference came about. And the East won, I think, 8 of the first 11 championships. After that, it was kind of dead even. You saw Nick Saban come into the conference and come out of the conference when he headed to the NFL. You saw Urban Meyer come into the conference, dominate quickly, and then leave a couple years later when he retired. And then that kind of created a void in some ways where teams could step up, and that's when you saw LSU win a championship. You saw Georgia win the SEC at one point in that period. And then the most recent era has simply been dominated by Nick Saban. Alabama's won the majority of conference championships over the last 8 to 9 years. Auburn had one when it had a transcendent player with Cam Newton, and there have been some other kind of contenders along the way there, but the SEC West consistently has been deeper. The SEC West has consistently been more top-heavy, and the best coaches, until proven otherwise, still reside in the West with Nick Saban. Jimbo Fisher, one of only 4 active national title-winning coaches. Gus Malzahn is one of the better coaches in the country as well. And we're seeing the rest of the division kind of reset around them, but that's a pretty strong base. Whereas on the other side, you've got Jeremy Pruitt and Dan Mullen, who are a bit untested at their current schools. Will Muschamp, you're not really sure what you're going to get out of that South Carolina program moving forward. And obviously we see Kirby Smart ascending very quickly, but we have to see more out of his program before we can kind of put him in that category along with a Saban or a Jimbo Fisher.
Chris, I guess this kind of sums up also how much of a meat grinder the SEC West has been since Nick Saban took over at the University of Alabama in 2007. You've had 2 coaches from the SEC West that won national championships who have been fired from their job. I mean, when you talk about Les Miles, tried to combine him with Gus there, Les Miles and Gene Chizik. I mean, these are guys that won national championships at SEC Western Division outpost since Nick Saban has been in Tuscaloosa, and they're gone. They've been fired. It's been an absolute meat grinder for the last decade, no doubt about it. Now, here closer to home, Chris, some big news earlier in the week, a couple of days of news as it relates to the Alabama football program. You had sophomore linebacker Vandarius Cowan dismissed from the team on Monday. Then on Tuesday, news breaks that Terrell Lewis, the junior outside linebacker who appeared to be set for a huge year, perhaps a year in which he could springboard to the NFL he goes down with a torn ACL. Time frame for his return is unknown. We talked about this for a piece that you did on the story, on the news earlier in the week. Now, you know, from the national perspective, which is your viewpoint of college football for 247sports.com, is it elsewhere around the country, is it kind of viewed as a situation, well, Saban's got 4 or 5 more Terrell Lewis, he'll just plug and play and they won't miss a beat? Is that sort of the way it's perceived elsewhere?
I think the casual fan does kind of feel that way. I think that's what happens when you have, I think at one point, 7 or 8 straight number 1 overall recruiting classes. You kind of just have this expectation that Alabama can plug and play. And honestly, we talked about this a little bit. It's kind of true in some ways. You're not going to have another Terrell Lewis exactly, but few teams are equipped with the depth long-term that Alabama is to kind of endure losses like that. We saw it last year with the way Alabama handled losses in its linebacker core. That position was just devastated by injuries, and it still managed to win a national championship, right? But as you pointed out, there's nobody quite like Lewis on the roster with his ability to kind of rush off the edge and also hold against the run and kind of be that disruptive pass rushing presence that Alabama needs on the outside in that position. Anthony Jennings is obviously a presence at Jack, but his role is a little more of a run defender and edge holder as opposed to Lewis, who just gets after the quarterback as a professional job. And it'll be interesting to see how it's handled, but that definitely is probably the perception nationally. I think it's just a little true and a little not true, if that makes sense.
As we look ahead to the upcoming season, you also did a very interesting piece on 5 contenders in 2018 whose chances will be helped by their regular season schedule, and then you gave 5 contenders who will be hurt by their regular season schedule. One of those teams that you had among the 5 that will be helped by their schedule was the Alabama Crimson Tide. I don't know anyone that could really argue otherwise, but let me throw this at you, Chris. If Alabama at the end of the regular season finds themselves in the very same situation they were in last time around, could that schedule ultimately hurt Nick Saban's team?
I think it could. I even think you saw that a little last year. Obviously, the committee didn't feel that way, but you saw a lot of arguments against Alabama based on their schedule, because Florida State didn't end up being the game that everybody thought it would be. And then the West was so down last year, and the SEC as a whole, that with the loss to Auburn at the end of the season, Alabama just didn't have that resume that people thought was worthy. Obviously, it didn't really matter, but that was an argument that was being made. And the same thing could happen this year, potentially, if Alabama loses in there and doesn't make it back to the SEC title game. But I think if you're Nick Saban and you have the team that you do, you kind of take your chance with that. Give me a schedule that's a little more easy to navigate as opposed to a schedule that's going to come up with 4 or 5 really big challenges during the year. With Alabama, as you've said many times in this program, I'm sure, it doesn't really have a true test until November. And if you give Alabama 3 games to get into the playoffs in November, you have to feel pretty good about the way a season's going to go overall.
It also helps, doesn't it, when you have an injury to a guy like Terrell Lewis, and as you just said, and I agree wholeheartedly, before you get to November, it's hard to find a legit challenge for this team. That gives you 2 months of the regular season to get some other guys ready to go and playing at a high level in place of Terrell Lewis or maybe someone else you have that goes down with an injury, right?
Yeah, and that is another thing that you see with the quarterback battle as well. No matter who starts, you're going to have 2 months to figure it out and find the best possible combination for your offense. And that gives you so much time to kind of experiment. And nobody's better in college football in experimenting, mixing and matching, and also kind of adjusting on the fly than Nick Saban is. So it's a huge advantage.
You mentioned that quarterback situation. Here's a question I've been throwing around to various guests we've had on the program that cover college football. Most likely to start his team's 2018 season opener, Joe Burrow at LSU or Jalen Hurts at Alabama?
I would have to say Joe Burrow, because I think it's pretty near certainty that he'll end up starting at LSU. I know Ed Orgeron keeps saying that it's an open quarterback battle, but if you're Joe Burrow and your dad's an assistant coach at Ohio and you know how the college football world works, you're not going to just show up at LSU without at least a pretty close to a guarantee that you're going to play. Whereas Jalen, I still personally think Tua is going to end up starting in that battle, so I would definitely go with Joe Burrow at that point.
There you go. We're talking with Chris Hummer, college football national writer for 247sports.com on a Thursday edition of Southern Pride Sports, presented by Carty & Lloyd, attorneys at law, and also Mercedes-Benz of Tuscaloosa. Another list that you gave us here not too long ago at 247sports.com, Chris, 10 games that will swing the college football season, and I thought there was a sneaky good one in there. When you talk about a road trip that the Auburn Tigers will make, a short one, but still a road trip, ask Alabama about this one after last November. On October the 6th, Auburn visits Mississippi State. That has a chance to be a game that maybe isn't as much on the radar going into the season, that with the expectations for both these teams will be huge.
Yeah, I think in kind of in the West, you have to assume Alabama is going to be there at the end of the season. It's going to be one of those 2 teams that has a chance to win the West by the time the Iron Bowl comes around. The real question is kind of who steps up there and fills that other void and challenges the Tide. LSU is often that team, but I'm not really sure how most people nationally feel about LSU heading into the season. There's a lot of question marks. But both Auburn and Mississippi State have a legitimate chance to win the West this season. That might surprise some people in terms of the Bulldogs, but they return more starters than anybody in the SEC. Nick Fitzgerald's a proven commodity at quarterback. They have excellent skill talent on the outside. And their defense features one of the probably best 5 or 6 defensive linemen in the country in Jeffrey Simmons. He's a potential first-round pick next year. There's a lot of pieces around him that can really play. And I know there's a first-year staff coming in, but they inherit all the talent in the world you need to contend right away. And I think it's a huge test for Auburn, which is going to have national title expectations this year. Starkville isn't the easiest place to play, as Alabama found out last year. And if Auburn isn't careful, the Iron Bowl might not mean anything by this time in the schedule, because Mississippi State could have the edge in the SEC West if it wins this game, which is why I think it's critical.
Yeah, when you look at Auburn, really, just about every month, the Tigers are going to be in one of these kind of swing games. It starts with the season opener against Washington, go to Mississippi State in October, and then, of course, road games also to Georgia and Alabama in November. So Auburn going to be very much in the middle of things, both on the conference and national level, as we move throughout the upcoming season. Finally, as we let you go here, Chris, you also did a ranking of the top coaching jobs in all of college football. At the top of your list, the one right here in Tuscaloosa. Tell us how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, well, I guess it's ranking season in the college football calendar, but so it was just kind of a formula based on winning available money, prestige, and a couple other things that factored in. And then you also have to use the dose of your personal opinion. But right now, I don't think there's much question that Alabama is the best job in college football. It's been a historically great job, and kind of one of the main ideas behind the piece is if the best possible coach picks to go to that school, what's possible at that school. And we've kind of seen how dominant Alabama can be with the right coach, and that's Nick Saban. Now, I don't know if I'd want to be the guy that follows Nick Saban, but you also, if you're in that situation of every available possible resource, Nick Saban doesn't want for anything in Tuscaloosa. His recruiting budget's huge. Facilities are top-notch. I think we even saw during the spring game at one point, he had a toothpick guy. He literally took it out of his mouth and handed it to a GA. So there's nothing at Alabama that you don't have. And then people might say that the state of Alabama doesn't produce as much recruiting talent as other states, but Alabama is actually kind of surprisingly deep in that category. Plus, it's so easy to reach into a Florida or reach into a Georgia nearby with the reputation that Alabama has. So, yeah, I think Alabama is pretty clearly the top job in college football right now if everything were to come open today.